It sounds like the plot of a Capra movie. Born in a sharecropper's cabin in Franklin County, he hitchhiked to the University of Alabama with just over $2 to his name. He lived in an abandoned campus building, juggled a half-dozen part-time jobs, and graduated a year ahead of schedule with a law degree and the presidency of the student body.
And that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which you're about to enter, so help you God.
Elected to Congress in 1948, Carl Elliott never forgot those early experiences. In fact, they became the inspiration for his lifelong political mission.
I would hate to think that everybody who attended the university of any universities in this state or other state in the future had to do the things I did to become a fairly educated person.
Carl Elliott fought to extend educational opportunities to all Americans. He became a tireless advocate of better schools and libraries. All the inductees into the 1999 University of Alabama College of Communication and Information Sciences Hall of Fame have championed vital causes and made a better future for us all through the disciplines of this college. Tonight, we celebrate their achievements and renew our commitment to their legacy by continuing to advance the democratic arts. As a new congressman, Carl Elliott was inspired by FDR and the New Deal. Elliott thought it was in the nation's interest to rebuild opportunity in the impoverished South and to make education a meritocracy for everyone. But federal aid to education was a controversial issue, and no bill providing money for buildings, equipment, or tuition had ever passed.
And I thought it'd be a pretty nice thing for a country bumpkin from up here in North Alabama to be the author of that thing.
Elliott's first piece of legislation was an education bill. It failed, but his resolve did not. In the course of a highly productive career, which included sponsorship of major public works legislation, waterway development, highway expansion, and one of the most extensive public housing programs in the nation, he also waged a 10-year uphill battle for federal aid to education. His first victory came in 1956 with the passage of the Library Services and Construction Act, which brought rural libraries and bookmobiles to 300 American counties where there were none before.
The Library Services Act was, in fact, the first major federal legislation to provide funding for public libraries. It extended public library services to over 40 million people living in rural areas, people who had previously had no library services at all, including over a third of the counties in Alabama.
Then, in 1958, after extensive research, a media campaign, and a nationwide tour of schools, the Soviet launch of Sputnik provided the final catalyst for passage of the National Defense Education Act, sponsored by Elliott and Alabama Senator Lister Hill. In its first 10 years alone, it would spend more than $3 billion and provide loans to over 1 million students. And that was only the beginning.
The whole National Defense Education Act was the real initial primer in this whole development on education policy.
The subsequent impact of the American Student Loan Program on the lives of individuals and in creating a more informed and diverse electorate on the life of the nation, it is beyond measure. Elliott went on to become a key player in a new Democratic administration, often quietly casting the swing vote on the powerful House Rules Committee, enabling progressive legislation to pass, including civil rights bills. Ironically, these victories assured his political demise. He was defeated in the congressional election of 1964 and the gubernatorial race of 1966. In both campaigns, he was the victim of racial demagoguery. Elliott would ultimately be honored for his statesmanship and courage. His 1990 selection as the first recipient of the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award and the subsequent publication of his autobiography would again bring him national attention, but his proudest achievement never changed.
But I do want to be remembered as being a friend of the poor, and I want to be remembered as a person who did something to improve their education in America now and for the future.
It's Max! Boomer!
46 years ago, Bob Luckey created what would become one of the most successful advertising agencies in the South. Born in Clanton and raised in Montgomery, Luckey attended Birmingham Southern and worked in the code room at Admiral Nimitz's headquarters during World War II.
Now that's not breaking code, that's what the smart boys did. Any dummy can encode and decode.
Luckey returned to the Birmingham News as a reporter for a month, then moved into the ad department before taking a chance, leaving to form Luckey Advertising in 1953.
If I had known how little I really knew, I probably would never have left the womb of the Birmingham News. But after having had both editorial and advertising experience, I thought I knew a great deal more than I actually knew. But it worked out. The Lord takes care of drunks and fools, and I qualify on both counts.
He's smart. You know, he uses his personality to build up his business, and he carries on that crazy way of, chatting and telling jokes, and they always like being with him, and everybody likes to be with him.
Luckey's small ad shop was no joke to local competitors. It quickly grabbed a major account, R.L. Ziegler, but it was South Central Bell that launched the agency. The Atlanta firm that held the huge telephone account stumbled, and Luckey landed one of the top accounts in the South.
When I think about Bob Luckey,
Wallace Bunn, former president of South Central Bell,
and all of the things that he's done, he's a good corporate citizen, very good corporate citizen. In fact, Bob has been elected to the Alabama Academy of Honor. Bob was in the first group of business leaders to be elected to the Birmingham Hall of Fame. He's the epitome of an advertising executive. And with all of this, he never takes himself seriously. Bob has said, since I've known him, that he wanted to be known as Ace Luckey. He says, but the word ace never caught on. And of course, you play golf with him, you understand why ace didn't catch on.
By the 60s, Luckey had picked up a partner, Hall of Fame broadcaster John Forney. By the 70s, the Luckey and Forney Advertising Agency had become a force well beyond the state. Luckey's personal drive and charisma grew the agency's client list, but it was results that counted.
So much advertising is blue sky today, and the answer to that, when you question it, we've got to get attention in all the clutter. Well, you get attention, but it's the wrong kind of attention. People say, what are they talking about? What are they selling? And a good advertisement, in my mind, should answer the old age question to the prospective buyer. What's in it for me? And I'm bragging when I say this, that this agency has brought to Alabama a big league aspect of advertising that was lacking before.
For Bob Luckey and South Central Bell, it didn't get much bigger than a series of award-winning TV ads from 1981 that reflected the Luckey style and philosophy.
One of the first things we tell our players is to keep in touch with their families. And when our freshmen first arrive, we ask them to write a postcard home right then. You know, we keep them pretty busy, but they always have time to pick up the phone and call. And it's real important to keep in touch. Have you called your mama today? I sure wish I could call mine.
Reach out and touch someone.
1952, Atlanta's WSB Radio, the voice of the South, is languishing.
Television had made such great strides and was so popular in its early years that radio was sort of in the doldrums. In fact, some people were predicting that radio was going to die and be supplanted by television.
But the reports of radio's death were greatly exaggerated, thanks to Elmo Ellis, the inventor of community radio. Ellis is the product of a remarkable community himself, West Blockton, an Alabama mining town with enough Jewish families, most of them from Eastern Europe, to support its own synagogue. And he was shaped by the community of scholars at the University of Alabama. An aspiring writer in his hometown, he was a perspiring writer on campus.
But I also wrote for the Crimson White and for the Corolla and for the Rammer Jammer, and eventually got an opportunity to edit all of those publications.
After graduation, WSB Radio needed a writer, and then Uncle Sam did too. During the Second World War, Ellis wrote and produced programs for the Army Air Force. He worked with Glenn Miller. He roomed with William Holden. After the war, there was a new challenge awaiting him at WSB, signing on the South's first television station.
I spent 4 years in television, and interestingly enough, during those 4 years, we experimented with and did, I believe, just about any kind of television program that you see on the air today.
He could have pursued his career in television with just as much success, but he was a team player and he worked for a corporation where they wanted him to get life back into radio.
My management asked if I would come back into radio and see if I could pump some life into it. And that led to my efforts that now are spoken of as so strongly community-oriented.
He brought immense talent, natural talent, lots of energy, curiosity, enthusiasm, a demand for perfection. He was very exacting. He was very determined.
I reasoned that what we needed to do was to develop local programs using local people. And for instance, we started sending radio reporters around covering events that were happening around town, putting on news at any moment.
He invented community radio, and it was so successful that stations around the nation copied him. Ellis and WSB received a Peabody Award for removing the rust from radio. Today, retired from broadcasting, Ellis is involved in philanthropic organizations, he paints, and he writes popular and successful motivational books. And he remembers what made WSB great.
When I got into broadcasting, broadcasting itself believed, and the people that I worked for believed, that you should operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And as a result, we tried to really serve the public and to do that which the public wanted and needed.
The writer who resuscitated radio still comes in loud and clear.
Like all young guys, I guess, coming along in the business, we all talked to him about what was the formula for success. And in that phraseology, he used to use the expression that the first dollars that you make should be used by you for your family, and then second for you. And that should always come after the dollars were spent that should be spent for the community, because the newspaper really belonged to the community.
Carmage Walls grew up on a 2-horse farm in South Georgia. His career started in Orlando in the 20s, catching newspapers as they came off the press. He was 15 and had just left high school to help support his family. Walls was a quick study, and by age 24 he was in Macon, Georgia, as general manager and publisher. He went on to Gadsden, Alabama as president of General Newspapers. Walls had developed a deep understanding of business finance and complex tax laws and started buying newspapers. Thus began a long career of mentoring future newspaper managers across the South. To Carmage Walls, a newspaper was like a semi-public utility, and ownership meant a paper had tremendous responsibility to the community it served.
I think that people sometimes looked at Mr. Walls and didn't understand the secret of his success, which was to understand people and to understand the markets that they served and the communities that they served, and give them the freedom to succeed or fail on their own. And that was just a priceless gift that very few people in business have these days.
my younger brother, who I may not should tell his story on, when he went to work at one of the newspapers, he was driving back home with his father one day, and he said, "Dad, these people think you're God."
Walls owned scores of newspapers during his career, including the Tuscaloosa News and Montgomery Advertiser in the 60s, where he ended the paper's practice of segregating the news of blacks and whites and opposed Governor Wallace's moves to preserve segregation.
He ultimately had a cross burned in his front yard. Governor Wallace, I think, wanted to tell him how to run the paper, and he explained he couldn't, so I don't know that they stayed friends very long. But
you had to publish your newspaper with the strength of conviction that it needed in order to represent its community. And you had to have the guts, if you will, to be able to do that.
Carmage Walls loved flying his small planes across the South in search of newspapers to buy, and then coming home to Alabama to raise his Tennessee walking horses. He was a self-educated farm boy who had a bounding desire to be a success, and a strong family man who enjoyed passing memorable experiences on to his children. Carmage Walls died in 1998. He was 90. His legacy continues with the many successful newspaper publishers whose careers he helped launch with a formula that remains powerful in its simplicity.
I think Mr. Walls took more pride in helping other people than he did in his own accomplishments. In fact, I know that's true. In talking to Mr. Walls, he almost never talked about things that he did personally, but he did talk a great deal about the accomplishments of people like Jim Boone and Jim Hale and Ben Smith and his own children and others who he had helped into the newspaper business and who had just coincidentally adopted a lot of his techniques and had succeeded in doing that.
My first impressions were that she was as mean as a drill sergeant and tougher than a junkyard dog. And as is often the case, first impressions were correct.
He's speaking of his beloved debate coach, Annabelle Dunham Haygood. She was only 22 when she came to the university in 1946 to revive the debate program. Her classes were filled with veterans, most older than she, eager to get on with life.
It was bustle, tremendous amount of movement.
Within 3 years, her team had won Alabama's first national debate championship.
We went in well organized, well prepared, or you weren't on the debate squad. And she would debate against us in practice sessions. As I recall, she had won a women's championship when she was in college.
Not one, I think of 3 or 4.
Well, she was a national champion in her own right before she ever came. And when she debated against you, you knew that the best was coming at you, and she really helped prepare you in that sense. So I would say that she had outstanding qualities of leadership, motivation. She worked hard, and she expected you to work hard.
No one could have known that her astonishing success would come so quickly or last so long.
Quite frankly, I was so young at that point. I was wonderfully optimistic. I really didn't know.
Her teams barnstormed the nation, West Point by train, Waco by battered station wagon, Georgetown, Tulane, often making do with limited support.
We couldn't get the luggage into the car for one of the very, very early road trips. So Mr. Newton had to borrow the net off the tennis court. I think Mr. Newton had to replace the net off the tennis court too, but that's how we put the luggage on the top of the car.
They needed a truck to bring back the trophies. Annabelle Haygood's students won 193 individual and team championships at the regional level and 23 national titles, and not a single debater had been recruited. They were all walk-ons.
As far as I was concerned, the greatest thing that the student could accomplish was to be selected for the debate team.
I can remember that several of us would skip class for a practice debate if we knew that Annabelle would be judging, because we simply couldn't stand for Annabelle to see us unprepared.
It was always exhilarating to be in her company. She gave off sparks. And there's a popular song, I think maybe from Sound of Music, that she exemplifies. Hearts can inspire other hearts with their fire. She had it, and she inspired us.
So this is something that I think was a very important part of Annabelle's impact. She had a phenomenal image. Her students respected everything about her. They held her in awe, and they wanted her approval, and they gave her everything that they had.
There were countless other accomplishments. She presided over professional organizations, reshaping and revitalizing them. For 10 years, she fought for the recognition of the University of Alabama Faculty Senate and served as its first president. Which of her many accomplishments, one wonders, was the most satisfying?
The ones which were the most difficult to.
She's purely and simply the best. You just can't get any better than she is at what she's done. She's the, to her field, what Bear Bryant was to coaching, what Mark McGuire is to hitting home runs. She's just the tops.
I haven't seen one of those in a while in just so many years.
Evolutionary biologist Edward O. Wilson earned both his Bachelor and Master of Science degrees at the University of Alabama and went on to a 40-year career at Harvard University. There he earned notoriety as a world authority on ants, a pioneer in the controversial field of sociobiology, and a prolific and eloquent writer. For Wilson, writing is not simply a means of communicating about his work, but a catalyst for scientific theorizing.
The question of how writing affects creative thinking in science is a very profound and interesting one. And in my own experience, there's a very strong connection. As it goes onto paper, I've found often ideas come to me.
In addition to hundreds of scientific articles, Wilson has written or co-authored more than 20 books, winning Pulitzer Prizes for On Human Nature in 1979 and The Ants in 1991. He does most of his writing with paper and pen, often over lunch in neighborhood restaurants near his Lexington, Massachusetts home.
When I was about 9 years old, I just loved writing little stories about insects that I was reading about and studying and collecting. So I think it was a combined interest that I had in natural history from an early age and a love of writing about it that led me to a career, an auxiliary career anyway, in my maturity as a writer.
I think it's critically important to have true eminent scientists who are articulating the complexities of science in this age of science in which we live. And Ed Wilson is without peer in that regard. Ed has the most remarkable capacity to deal with both complexity and with controversy of any thinker or writer I've ever known.
Transforming the substance, methodology, and way of thinking of science into literary form is a very valuable exercise, but it's very tricky because literature to a large extent depends upon metaphor. And the reason that literature depends upon metaphor is that metaphor evokes feeling and emotion. And when you embed what we know by the methods of science to be solid information into a metaphorical framework, you have to be very careful about your metaphors.
He is a master of metaphor. He uses metaphors very extensively in his writing, and yet he does it with an amazing clarity. You know that the metaphor is really telling the story.
I'm reminded of what Eudora Welty once said, and I've discovered that others said it before her, so it must be a very universal, nearly universal truth. She said, "How do I know what I think until I have written it?" Yes, the very act of writing, literally, the keystroke or the pen moving, is the greatest stimulant, I think, for creative thought.
Stimulating creative thought. That is undeniably at the heart of everything we do at this university and in this college. We must inspire and sustain entrepreneurs and unorthodox thinkers, nurture and encourage those who promote the vigorous exchange of ideas, assist and applaud visionary communicators, celebrate industry leaders who tirelessly promote and serve their communities. We must lift up as examples leaders with the courage to be statesmen, and we must embrace those with brilliant and audacious ideas and urge them on. These are the challenges for the College of Communication and Information Sciences on the eve of the 21st century. We will continue the work of our honorees tonight as we advance the democratic arts.